Hey everyone, I'm Paige Smith with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy show. Below the Radar is created by my office, SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement, and is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This time on Below the Radar, our host Am Johal is joined by Edgard Villanueva-Cruz and Jessica Savoy from Alive, the Aboriginal Life in Vancouver Enhancement Society. Edgar and Jessica share some of their salient recommendations from their youth-led report, Our Place, Our Home, Our Vision, Youth Voices of East Vancouver. They discuss how to uphold Indigenous rights in BC and beyond, and the importance of having urban Indigenous people as part of the governance where decisions are being made. I hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey, hi there. Welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us today. I'm really excited to be speaking with Edgard and Jessica, who are actually neighbors of mine at 312 Main Street. They're with an organization called Alive. They recently produced a report that was an outcome of a conference that happened back in April or so, I believe. February, earlier in the spring, but the report came out a little bit later. And wondering if we can just maybe start with both of you introducing yourselves a little bit.
Yep. Hi there. My name is Jessica Savoy. I am Nisga'a First Nations from Northern British Columbia on my mom's side, and I'm also French and Italian on my dad's side from New Brunswick. Just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in Vancouver, and it's an honor to be here today. Thank you.
I'm Edgard Villanueva-Cruz. I'm Teltan, Casca, and part of Salvadorian. I've lived on and off reserve mostly my entire life. Came here about 5 years ago, been living here ever since, and thank you for having me today.
Great. I'm wondering if you can maybe just start by talking about this report and what some of the outcomes and findings were, and maybe also the process that led to the conference itself and the work you've been doing for many years.
So really this project came about, or the report came about, really connecting with Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth in the inner city, 5 neighborhoods of East Vancouver. So that would be Hastings Sunrise, Strathcona, Grandview Woodlands, the downtown east side, and Mount Pleasant. I believe that's the 5 neighborhoods. And we were really connecting with the youth and engaging them to see what changes they would like to see in their neighborhoods. And that's really what came about this report. We decided to apply for federal funding, and we were approved. And so this initiative really kicked off last year around March, April of 2019. And it really started with an advisory council made up of 10 Indigenous and 10 non-Indigenous youth, where we sat down with them. We heard their concerns, and which really started the creation of the policy conference, which was in February 2020. And they identified the 9 policy areas, which is in the report itself.
Edgar, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. So along with the policy conference, we had many consultations with youth. We data mined, we took surveys in order to create this thing by hosting workshops and forums as well with the advisory committee. And now we moved into stage 2, which is the implementation of the policy document.
Mm-hmm. Once you have a lot of really clear recommendations to different levels of government, and also establishing new bodies, and particularly with representation of Indigenous young people in the process of policy making, and wondering if you can maybe outline some of the major recommendations that are in the report that you're trying to push forward right now.
Okay, for sure. So one of the most important recommendations I view as being the foundational aspect of this policy document is you'll find it in the Urban Indigenous Self-Government section and citizenship. And it would be the last recommendation, which is establishing a network of urban Indigenous organizations to advance through dialogue and partnerships the goal of self-determination for urban Indigenous peoples.
Right. Jessica?
I think for me, a recommendation that stands out would be in the same policy area, and that would be to increase awareness and understanding of UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Last year, November, it was passed in the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia, Bill 41, which is BC's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And really, I think that is one of the most important recommendations in this, alongside the recommendation that Edgard pointed out, because it outlines, the basic fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and all around the world. And, it's really great to see the movement of the provincial government and how they want to honor the rights of Indigenous peoples. I guess we'll wait and see how that applies to urban Indigenous peoples living off of reserve and what they will do to implement those rights and uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples in urban areas.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was really impressed reading the report, its human rights orientation, its linkage to UNDRIP, and Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. These are reports that were already done many years ago, but it really actualizes things on the ground in terms of what's happening here in East Vancouver. And I'm wondering, since the report came out, some of your conversations with government that you've had, either elected people or within bureaucracies of City of Vancouver or provincial, federal governments, how have some of those conversations gone at this stage?
Mm-hmm. Edgard?
All right. Well, at this stage currently, our conversations with government, federal government, and provincial representatives will be that they've endorsed our document and they've promised to take it all to all levels of government and the 338 seats in the House of Commons. And they're also seeking to do this alongside us, with NDP really going out of their way to support us, with Melanie Mark, Member of Parliament, and Jenny Kwan, MLA.
I think also it's important to recognize in our processes, we follow protocol in, sending this report out to, BC First Nations. And, there are over 200 Indian band councils. That's what we did, was we sent this out to all of the First Nations in British Columbia. And since then we have invited Member of Parliament Jenny Kwan to one of our meetings, our last meeting in September, as well as the Member of the Legislative Assembly, Melanie Mark. And so they made the commitment of sending, like Edgard had mentioned, sending this report out to their colleagues. And so we will wait and see, what happens from that. And with the election coming on October 24th, it's really interesting. And what I'm interested in seeing is the platforms that they have, the commitments that they're going to make on all parties, and how they're going to uphold the rights of urban Indigenous peoples and how that relates to UNDRIP.
You'd both mentioned the piece around urban Indigenous governance. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit, what you mean by that, or how you could see it being actualized.
Mm-hmm. I think what we mean for urban Indigenous self-government is a new model of governance. So for every, in British Columbia, we have Indigenous peoples of all nations. We have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And for British Columbia alone, we have about 78% of Indigenous peoples live off reserve. And nationwide, across Canada, that percentage is around 60%. So it is an even higher number in British Columbia of urban Indigenous peoples or peoples who are living off reserve. And oftentimes they're not considered, where decisions are being made. They're not at the table. And this is what we're talking about, is creating a new government model or governance model where we can invite, the urban Indigenous population or those who are living off reserve away from their communities to sit at the table and have a voice where decisions are being made. And so it's for us to create, and we are creating the narrative. We are the ones who are going to create this model. It's a new model, and this is where it's really important to recognize that we follow protocol with connecting with the First Nations. We want to work with them. We want their support. We want them to endorse this initiative and walk with us on this journey. And that really started with connecting with local First Nations. So the 3 nations, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And then we'll move forward and see what that model looks like as well.
Edgard, maybe if you could maybe add to why you think this is so important, of why this should happen.
For sure. So, again, pulling up some statistics. So, Indigenous peoples in Vancouver, Indigenous women in Vancouver comprise over 50% of the missing and murdered women here in Vancouver. 30% of our Indigenous youth graduate. Now, that is an astronomically low number. And it becomes a very important issue because of the repatriation of the Constitution during the 1980s. And with the Constitutional Act, Section 35. And when you apply this with Section 9124, which outlines Indians and land reserved for Indians. Now, Section 35 elaborates upon the inherent right to self-government, yet that box has not been filled. And as of right now, that piece of legislation only pertains to Indigenous peoples that live on reserve or within our traditional territories. So when I think about why it's so important is I'm thinking about the interfacing of Section 9124, the federal fiduciary responsibility, which the government is not living up to with urban Indigenous peoples, and Section 9120, provincial jurisdiction, as well as Section 35, and how those all interface, because we have been ignored and explicitly discriminated against by the Constitution and the state of Canada. So it becomes very, very important that we recognize as Indigenous peoples and urban peoples, these are still our lands. Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands have not been ceded territories. These are still our lands. But the Canadian state does not want to recognize that. And so we are still in this constant push and tug battle with the fiduciary responsibilities of both the province and the Fed.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, as you go forward and disseminate the report and get it into the hands of people, are there further pieces of research you're interested in taking on, or what does the rest of your engagement sort of plan look like going forward in terms of people you want to engage and speak with to bring them on board in terms of making these recommendations land down on the ground?
I think really we're using this as a tool. And, there have been numerous reports released with, many recommendations, and those of which many had not been implemented or very little done since then. And I think it's really important also to recognize that this initiative is for the youth by youth. It's youth-led. And so we did receive promises from, members of Parliament and also members of the BC Legislative Assembly. We also want to take this nationwide. We want to send this to Justin Trudeau, who is the Minister of Youth, and also beyond. We'd also like to, and we will, connect with the United Nations. And yeah, I think that we're not going to stop the work. It's going to continue, and we'll see really where it goes. But this is a tool that anybody can use across the nation, to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially living off reserve. And it outlines a lot of recommendations, a lot of universal tools that are already out there. So we'll see.
Great. I'm wondering if there's anything that you'd both like to add. I'll start with you, Edgard.
Yeah, for sure. So like when you ask the question about what it looks like for our research and if we're going to do any more research, but it's about engagement as of right now. It's all about engagement. How do we engage with our people first and foremost? And then how do we engage with these systems of government that don't want to change? So it's really about us creating a narrative, pushing the agenda, and building this topic of self-government and governance in the way we see fit.
Great. Jessica, anything you'd like to add?
I think, just to outline what Edgard said, we're creating the narrative, and urban Indigenous peoples have been left out time and time again where decisions are being made. There's a lot of talk, but we want action. We need action because our people are dying on the streets. We're seeing youth who are dying in care and foster care in this child welfare system. And the list goes on. There's a huge housing crisis here in Vancouver, and I'm sure across the country. And so we need action. There's a lot of talk out there, but we need action. We to stop, the genocide that's going on. And I hate to say that word, but it's ongoing. Our people are dying. And so we need action. I think that's the number one thing.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and the incredible work that you do. We'll be linking to the report below. Hope you get a chance to read it. It's a really incredible report with some really important recommendations there, and it's already provoking important conversations that should have been happening a long time ago. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us on Below the Radar.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Below the Radar, and a special thanks to Jessica and Edgar for sharing their knowledge. We really encourage everyone to read the policy recommendations from Alive's report in full, which can be found in the description of this episode. Stay up to date with Below the Radar by following us on Twitter at BTR_pod and subscribe wherever you find your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Below the Radar.